Well, nothing is more inevitable in life than the reality that you are going to suffer. Now, in this series, we're not talking about cause and effect suffering, like as in when you speed, don't be too surprised when you suffer by paying a fine. We're talking about the kind of suffering that doesn't have necessarily an obvious or any cause and effect kind of relationship with your life. We're talking about the kind of suffering that happens when you're the student in your class who's diagnosed with a learning disorder. We're talking about the kind of suffering when the person that you love is diagnosed with the illness. The kind of suffering that happens when you are suffering a financial setback or hardship that you didn't cause, and it just had to do with things and forces beyond your control. And the reason why we're talking about this topic is because for 3 weeks we were looking at a book of the Bible called the book of Job, and there is no place in the Bible, and I think no place in all of literature, that deals with the topic and the reality and the inevitability of suffering with the integrity, the honesty, the transparency of the book of Job. Now, if you missed last Sunday, we started by answering a very important question, and the question we answered last week was why? Why do we suffer? Why me? Because it's universal human experience. When we suffer, why me? Why now? Why this? We ask why when we experience suffering. Now, I cannot possibly summarize last week's message in just a few moments. I think you owe it to yourself to go online and watch last week's message if you missed the answer to this question. But we did come up with an overarching theme that fills the entire book of Job, and therefore it fills this sermon series. And the big theme, the big idea to why is this: you won't realize that God is all you need until God is all that you have. When you get to the place in life until you have nothing else but God, that's when you'll realize God is all you need. Now, this is true of us no matter where you're at. If you are not a church person, you will not realize that God is all you need until God is all that you have. If you are a Christian, you won't realize that God is all you need until God is all that you have. Well, today we're turning a page in the book of Job, literally and figuratively, and today we're going to look at a different question, not the question of why, but we're going to look at a different question today, and the question today is this: it's how. How do I deal with suffering when it comes? How do I respond to suffering in my life? Where last week was very philosophical and theoretical and theological because we talked about why do innocent people suffer. Today we're going to get very practical because we want to know, how do you handle it when suffering comes into your life? And if you are in a season of suffering, you're going to get some very handy tools to take home with you today and put into practice immediately. For those of you who are not in a season of suffering, I'm telling you, you are going to want to get a handle on these before suffering comes so that when it inevitably comes, you'll be prepared to deal with it. Now, whenever we suffer, we instinctively look for sources of comfort. It's kind of like the suspension system on your car or truck. The reason why your vehicle has a suspension system is because it is inevitable that you're going to hit potholes. It is inevitable that there will be bumps in the road. Not figurative bumps in the road of life. Literally, when you're driving down Highway 67, let's say theoretically, you are going to hit some bumps in the road, some potholes, and your suspension system is there so that your car does not shake apart, so that you do not lose control while you are hitting rough roads. In the same way, in life, in suffering, we need some kind of suspension system. We need some source of stabilization or some source of comfort so that when we inevitably hit the metaphorical potholes and bumps of life, we won't lose control, our lives won't shake apart. We need to find sources of comfort. Now, you already do this instinctively. All of us as humans do this automatically. Depending on how big the suffering is, that influences how you're going to approach it. For example, if you've got some low-grade suffering in your life, let's say you have a bad day at work, you instinctively seek comfort. How do you seek comfort when you have a low day of work? Maybe you like ice cream. Maybe you go shopping. Maybe you have a few drinks. Maybe you binge watch Netflix. I don't know what you do, but some are healthy, some are not healthy, but we instinctively look for comfort. But then there's more medium range suffering, something more significant. This is, I just had a huge financial setback, or I am just in conflict and had a big argument with someone who's very important to me in my life. My marriage is on the rocks, kind of mid-level suffering. Well, you might pray about it, or you might cry about it, or you might go for a walk in the woods, or pray, whatever it is, you're going to find ways to find comfort. But what about catastrophic suffering? Because that's where Job is at. If you missed last week, Job lived over 3,000 years ago. It's very odd that he's in the Bible because he was not a Jewish man. He was an Eastern man. He was from the East, incredibly wealthy, incredibly successful, a pillar of his community. He was influential. People adored him, but he lost absolutely everything. He lost his wealth. He had 10 kids. All of them died. Lost his kids. Lost his health. He should have been in a hospital bed, but they did not have hospital beds yet. He lost absolutely everything in his life. Today, what we're going to discover from Job is how do you find sources of comfort when you are in suffering, whether mild or whether catastrophic. These are tools that are going to help you with that. Now, what's unique about the structure of the book of Job is that it's broken up into 3 parts. And because of that, just so you know up front, I'm going to completely smash one of my communication rules today. I know for some of you it's shocking to know that I actually follow rules when I communicate, but there's a set of rules I like and I like to follow when I build a talk, a sermon, and give it to you guys. Normally, I like to take one verse of the Bible or one small section of the Bible and just drill down on that and talk about that, so when you leave, it's like, okay, I get that. That was helpful. Thank you. Today, I'm going to be going through a ton of verses with you, and here's the reason why. Job chapters 1 and 2, what we looked at last week, it neatly deals with the question of why we suffer, and it's all compact and it's all right there. Next week, we're going to look at chapters 38 through 42, and in those chapters, God neatly and cleanly addresses. He speaks into the issue of our suffering, so you're not going to want to miss next week because we're going to see what God has to say about all of this. But then in the middle of the book, what you find are 35 chapters of dialogue. And in these 35 chapters of dialogue, you see Job talking with his 3 friends, wrestling through and figuring out why he is suffering and how he can deal with his suffering, how he can deal with his pain and with his agony. And the reason why I'm going to look at a lot of verses is because the book of Job, the narrative, the discussion, it's very true to real life. When you're in suffering, especially when you're grieving or in loss like Job was, you do not process your emotion and you do not process the grief in a clean, linear, and orderly fashion, do you? How do you process the emotion? A crazy wave of emotion comes in and overwhelms you from out of nowhere. You're just at work or whatever, all of a sudden a wave of emotion hits you and it pushes you one way. And finally, when that wave kind of goes out, another wave of emotion comes in from over here. And it's an emotion you thought you already dealt with, but here it is again, and it's back, and you don't know what to do with it. That's how we go through grief. That's how we go through suffering as emotional human beings. And as you read these middle chapters, a lot of people get frustrated, especially the first time they read through Job. Maybe some of you have started reading it since we started this series last week. It's frustrating because as you're reading it, it seems to just really wander and not be going anywhere. That's because it's very realistic. That's how Job processed his suffering and his grief. He had to work through it. What that means is occasionally he breaks through to moments of incredible clarity and faith, only to have another wave just kind of push him back out to sea. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you a summary. We're going to look at some key verses from this section, and I'm going to show you some of those points of clarity where Job found comfort in his suffering. Now, last week we ended off with the question of why do we suffer? At the end of it, Job was still worshiping God, still faithful to God. And here's how chapter 2 ends and transitions us into the middle section of the book. It says, when Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. So he's got three friends. They're different ethnicities. Job is so prominent there. He's connected with everybody. So three of his friends, they say, we need to go help Job. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. So they come, they see how bad it is. They just sit with him. They can't even talk for 7 days. Well, when we read this, we think, yeah, that's what friends are for. Isn't that what friends are for? When you are down, you've got people who can come and help you and be there for you. Yeah, those are great friends. Well, what's interesting is that Job did not actually find them to be very helpful comforters. In fact, this is my favorite verse of the entire book of Job. You're going to get it right here. Here's his analysis of the kind of friends they were. Job 16:2. You are miserable comforters, all of you. Will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you that you keep on speaking? Now, have you ever wanted to say that to somebody? Seriously, do you have a disease that makes you keep talking? What is wrong with you? Would you just shut up? Now, why did Job say that? I mean, we think how nice they came to be with him. What led him to this conclusion? Here's why. Last week at the end, we saw that Job's wife had some counsel for him. Job's wife's counsel was, seriously, you're still trying to be a believer in God? Curse God and die. That was her advice. You should really just hate God. These three friends brought different advice to Job. And to summarize their advice, they said this: you should really hate yourself. Okay, she said you should hate God. They said you should hate yourself. She said you should blame God. They said, Job, you're actually the one to blame here. So he's just getting it from all sides. Now, it is interesting that when she said curse God and die, if you were here last week, you know how he responded. He said, you are talking like a foolish woman. Excellent marital communication tip, by the way, there, fellas. He doesn't say you are a foolish woman. He says, you know, sweetheart, over the years, I've bumped into a foolish woman or two, and they kind of sound like you do. But when these guys talk, he's like, "What? Do you have some kind of talking disease? You won't be quiet. You keep on talking." The point is this. If Job is going to find comfort, he's going to have to find his own comfort. His friends are not going to help him in this situation. Now, to get things started, if you're following along in your notes, I've got it on the screen too. Here's an example of the kind of advice they were giving him. The first one is from Eliphaz. Eliphaz is basically Mo of the Three Stooges, if you want to get this picture in your mind of these three guys. Here's what Eliphaz, Mo, says to Job. He says, call if you will, but who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? In other words, he said, Job, don't even waste your time praying. Call out to whatever God you want to. What holy God is going to answer you? No one's going to answer you, Job. This isn't a time to pray. You've got other issues to deal with. Resentment kills a fool, and envy slays the simple. I myself have seen a fool taking root, but suddenly his house was cursed. His children are far from safety, crushed in court without a defender. The hungry consume his harvest, taking it even from among the thorns. And the thirsty pant after his wealth, for hardship does not spring from the soil, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. Here's what he's saying. Here's his counsel to Job. Job, I've been around for a while, and you know what I've seen from time to time? I've seen fools, people who hate God, do not walk with God, they're fools, Eliphaz says. And for a season they'll flourish, for a season they'll be successful, but you know what inevitably happens? Inevitably they come to ruin. Why? Because they're fools. Job, buddy, you had a good run. You had a very successful season, but now it's coming to an end. Maybe you've been a fool. And he says at the end, for hardship does not spring from the soil, nor does trouble sprout out from the ground. Here's what he's saying. You know what, Job? When I go by a barley field, I know that the farmer sowed barley. And when I go by the wheat field, I know that the farmer sowed wheat. Job, I look at your life and I see trouble. I see suffering. You know what I know? you sowed trouble. Job, you reap what you sow. You are reaping what you have sown. The reason why this is happening to you is because you are getting paid back for what you've done. It's essentially karma. It's essentially moralism. You reap what you sow. God rewards the good people. God punishes the bad people. Job, buddy, you're getting punished by God. Clearly, the reason is you did something to make God unhappy with you. Now, it could be true, theoretically, it could be true that the reason why Job is suffering is because God does want to get his attention. If you read the book of the Bible, Jonah, for example, we see that Jonah was running away from God. God sent some strategic suffering into Jonah's life because Jonah didn't need to turn from sin and turn back to God. He could do that. But we, the reader of Job, know already that's not the reason why Job is going through suffering. Job is going through suffering because he's not going to realize that God is all he needs until God is all he has. So Eliphaz comes in assuming that he's got a moral problem, that he's got a moral issue, that he needs to confess some sins, that he needs to make things right with God. That's his assumption. But it's incredibly simplistic and incredibly reductionistic because we're not just moral beings. We're intelligent beings. We're spiritual beings. We're emotional beings. We're physical beings. Eliphaz thinks the answer to everything is, you're a sinner, repent. But at the same time, people who are secularists today are also too simplistic. We reduce everything to the physical. You just need to take a pill, Job. All are too reductionistic. The reality is that we see in the book of Job is a very nuanced reflection of reality and how we deal with sufferings as emotional and spiritual and physical and intellectual creatures. It's impossible for us to necessarily know up front what the cause of suffering is in someone's life. And the reason why Eliphaz doesn't see that is because Eliphaz does not understand the grace of God. Some of you don't either. When Eliphaz reads the Bible, he thinks it's a record of the good people who earned God's good blessings through their obedience. God rewards the good people and he punishes the bad people. The truth is this. The Bible is a record of people who suffered. Some of them suffered poorly, some of them suffered well, and God used their suffering to refine them. It's the story of people who were far away from God and would not be drawn near to Him until God broke through into their lives, many times through suffering, by His grace to draw them near to Him. It's a story of unworthy person after unworthy person, but God broke into their lives because He's a gracious God. That's the story of the Bible. And because He does not understand grace, God's love, God's forgiveness, He's going to blame Job and says, Job, you have to hate yourself because you did something wrong. God's getting you. What this means is, practically speaking, if you're the one who's not in the season of suffering, but someone else is, a friend of yours, a family member is in a season of suffering, don't presume to know the cause of the suffering, but approach it with the nuanced understanding that we see here. A great example of this, this was in a book written years ago. It's called A View from a Hearse. There's a guy by the name of Joe Bailey. He lost 3 of his sons to death, buried 3 of his sons. And he wrote a book about how he processed all this grief and how he dealt with it. Very interesting passage that we see in the book that describes how 2 different people approached him when it comes to this. He wrote, I was sitting torn by grief, and somebody came along and talked to me about God's dealings of why it happened, of hope beyond the grave. He talked constantly. He said things I knew were true. But I was unmoved except to wish that he would go away. And he finally did. Then another one came and sat beside me, and he didn't talk at all. He didn't ask me any leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour or more, listened when I said something, answered briefly, prayed simply, and left. I hated to see him go. Sometimes someone does need a Bible verse in their suffering. Sometimes they need a cookie. Sometimes they need a hug. Sometimes they need a prayer. Sometimes they need a friend to just sit with them. When you're ministering, when you're helping, when you're walking alongside someone who's suffering, be aware of that. Serve them in all ways, not in your way, because we are complex, living creatures. And gently guide them to God's truth. Well, Job doesn't have a friend like that. He's got friends who are just wasting his time, wearing him out, and giving him bad counsel. So, how is he going to find sources of comfort? Today we're going to see that there's 3 sources of comfort that Job found in his wrestling and in his suffering. And in fact, as you read the Bible, you'll find these 3 sources of comfort over and over and over again. So we're going to see what they are by looking strategically at a few different sections of the book. We're going to start in chapter 6, where Job answers Eliphaz's suggestion that he sowed trouble. Job 6, verses 2 through 4. Job said, "If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous." In other words, he's saying, this is horrible. My anguish, my agony is terrible. He continues, "The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me." Who's he blaming? God. It's God's terror, God's judgment, God bringing anguish on me. "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life. Then I would still have this consolation, my joy in unrelenting pain, that I had not denied the words of the Holy One." Job is praying horrible things here. He wants God to end his life. And the reason why he wants God to end his life is because right now, at this point, early in the grieving process, he only has one consolation. And his one consolation is that so far, he has not denied God. So far, he has not cursed God. But he realizes that could very well change very soon because I am running on empty. So in his wisdom, he says, if God strikes me dead now, then at least I'll be able to say, I held on to my faith. So he's very aware of his human frailty and weakness and very aware of the reality that he might soon renounce his faith in God. Now, what's interesting is here and in other sections of the book, the massive sections of his dialogue, Job says horrible things. He says terrible things. He asks God for things like, kill me, I have no reason to keep living. He accuses God. He gets mad at God. But if you read to the last chapter of the book, and we're going to look at this next week, at the end of the book, when all is said and done, God approaches Job and says, Job, you did well. You did all right, Job. Then he looks at Job's 3 friends and says, Larry, Curly, and Mo, you got problems. I am mad at you. In fact, if Job doesn't pray for you, I'm dropping my hammer right on your heads. Job, what should I do with these 3 knuckleheads? What do you want me to do? You want me to get them or do you want me to forgive them? It's up to you, Job. Now, how can God go to Job at the end of this saga and say, Job, you did great, you did well, when he is saying things like this? God, I want you to kill me. God, I'm mad at you. God, I'm angry with you. Why are you doing this to me? God, this is unfair. He goes through all of it. How can God say that he did a good job? The answer is simple. If you pay attention to these words, you're going to notice something. Job is not saying bad things about God. Job is saying bad things to God. And there's a difference. Job is taking whatever in his heart and he is praying it directly to God. You say, I don't see that. Look at the words. He says, oh, that God, oh, that God. In ancient times, when you approached the king with a request, you didn't say, hey, king, I need you to do something for me. You said, oh, that the king would grant my request. Look at Job's language. He's talking to a king. He says, oh, that God would grant what? My request. God, I'm talking to you. I'm asking for you to do something for me in my misery. He is praying out his anguish. He is praying out his grief. He is praying out his sorrow. He says all kinds of hard things about God, but he says them to God directly. And in that, and he maintains this through the book, in that we find our very first source of comfort in the book of Job. It's your first fill in the blank this morning. Pray with transparency. Pray with transparency. In your season of suffering, pray with transparency. Here's what I mean. Many Christians never advance in prayer beyond giving God your wish list. Dear God, give me this, give me that, give me this, give me that. You really treat him like a vending machine. Even in severe suffering, many Christians still approach God with a wish list. God, give me strength. God, give me relief. God, give me comfort. Give me, give me, give me. Still treating him like a vending machine. Should you ask for those things in prayer? Absolutely, go for it, but you need to advance beyond that. God does not just want to be your vending machine. He wants to be in relationship with you. And He invites you to take whatever is in your heart and pour it out to Him. You say, Jason, if I was honest with God and said what I really thought about Him when I'm in suffering, if I poured out my heart and got transparent, I got real with God about what I'm really feeling, I don't know if God would like that. Newsflash. God already knows what you think. God already knows what you feel. It's not as if you are going to pray something to God and God is going to be like, you're kidding. I had no idea that's how you felt about me. He already knows. All you're doing is making a fake and artificial relationship by failing to be forthright and honest and transparent with Him. I think He can handle it. I think He can handle how you feel. I think He can handle your thought process at the moment in the middle of your suffering. Job prayed with transparency throughout the book, and God said at the end, Job, you did well. You did well. Now, here's a little bonus extra credit. You do not have to pay for this today. I'm just going to add this as the cherry on your sundae. When you pray to God with transparency and you just pour out whatever's in your heart, God, I'm feeling this, I'm thinking this, here's what I think about you today, God. When you're done, I'm telling you, some of you came just for this today. When you're done, worship Him. Thank Him. Say, although this is how I feel right now, I am thanking you because I see these evidences of your grace in my life. And when you grieve out in prayer to God and then you thank Him, it will cleanse your heart and your soul and will align your heart and your soul with the will of sovereign God. Your first source of comfort that we see in Job and see throughout the Bible is to pray and to pray with transparency. All right, let's get to the second one. Job chapter 13, just a few chapters later. He again is praying to God. He's talking to God. He says, only grant me these two things. So early on, he's praying, take my life. Well, he's wrestled through that and he's gone beyond there. Now he's going to ask God for two different things that he's moved along in his process. Grant me these two things, God, and then I will not hide from you. Here's number one. Withdraw your hand far from me and stop frightening me with your terror. So one, you're killing me. Can I catch a little relief? Second thing is this. Then summon me and I will answer. Or let me speak and you reply to me. How many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offense and my sin. Here's what he's saying. Okay, give me a break because you're killing me with the suffering. And second thing is this, summon me. Call me into your presence. And you will speak and I will listen, or if you want me to talk and you listen, I don't care. But God, I just need to be in your presence. I need to be with you. In my suffering, I somehow need to know that you are in the suffering with me, that you are walking with me through it, that you are not against me, but that you are with me and you are for me. God, I need your presence. And this leads us to our second point, our second comfort in suffering. Seek God's presence. Seek God's presence in your suffering. Now, if you're not in a season of suffering right now, you're still interested in what these 3 points are because you know suffering's inevitable, but it's a little bit academic and it's a little bit curious. If you are in a season of suffering right now, if you can remember a recent one, you realize that when you are suffering, the thing you need more than answers about why you're suffering is to know that you are not alone in your suffering. Whether it's friends and family who are walking through it with you, or more importantly for Job, that God is walking through it with him, is what he needs to handle and withstand his suffering. What's interesting is in the Psalms, David prayed the exact same thing. Psalm 23, even if you're not a Christian, you've heard of Psalm 23. He says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, your presence, they comfort me. David walked through the valley of the shadow of death saying, God, your presence will keep me from the valley. He says, no, I'm going to be in the valley, but when I'm with you in the valley, I have comfort. When you are with me in the valley, I have comfort. Job is saying, God, if you will summon me, I will have your presence, and I will know that you are with me in the valley. Here's the problem for Job. How is he going to know if God is with him? How is he going to know God's presence? Well, the only way he's going to know is if God shows up. And of course, if you read the book of Job, you see that everything in the book is leading towards a very dramatic an inevitable crash course and collision between Job and God. We're going to get to that next week. You don't want to miss that. But what we see is that Job needs a miracle, an intervention, if he's going to know God's presence. And this is where you have access to a resource that Job did not have. Through Jesus Christ, God entered into our suffering. Because Jesus, when he came into the world, he entered into our suffering. He became mortal like us. He became weak like us. He was betrayed like us. He suffered injustice like us. He was killed like we will die. He walked among us. He lived among us. His presence dwelled among us. If we want to know that God is with us in our suffering, we need to look at the life of Jesus, who did not just live for us, he lived with us. And because of Jesus, who was willing to sacrifice himself to invite you into God's presence forever, he invited you into God's presence through his sacrifice for your sins. Because he did that, when you suffer, you might not know what the reason is, but you know what the reason isn't. The reason is not because God is banishing you from him. Because on the cross, Jesus was banished from the presence of God in your place, so that you could be welcomed into God's presence. So when you suffer, run to God. Run to Jesus. Say, I'm mad at him. Great. Pray it out to him. Pray with transparency. Seek God's presence so that you know that he's with you and for you in and through your suffering. Pray with transparency. Seek his presence. Let's get to the third one. Job chapter 14. Mortals born of women are of few days and full of trouble. They spring up like flowers and wither away. Like fleeting shadows, they do not endure. Now, if you're thinking of publishing one of those inspirational Bible verse calendars, I suggest you pass on this one. He continues. That's all I had to say about that verse. That's all. At least there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and its new shoots will not fail. So its roots may grow old in the ground, and its stump may die in the soil, yet at the scent of water it will bud and put forth shoots like a plant. So what he's saying is this. Okay, if a tree's cut down, there's still hope for it. Why? It still has roots. It'll sprout back up to life. Now, what we think Job is going to say is, when we suffer, we're being pruned, because that is a common metaphor used throughout the Bible. When we suffer, it is a pruning effect where you cut back a vine or a shrub or a tree. It grows back stronger. It grows back hardier. It can be more fruitful. The Bible does talk about that a lot. It says, when you suffer, God is pruning you so you can come back stronger, more fruitful. In fact, you might know people who have had to suffer very little in life. You might know people, they were sheltered by their parents bought them their first car, their parents paid for school, they just had a really easy life. But a lot of times, they're lightweights. I don't know how else to say it. They don't have a lot of weight or hardiness to them. In fact, when you've gone through suffering and they're your friend, they seem completely incapable of helping you in your suffering, because it's like they don't know what to do. They've never faced that kind of hardship or suffering before. And we think Job is going to say, just like a tree, it can grow back after it is cut back and it'll be stronger than ever. Then all of a sudden, Job takes a hard turn and does a major Debbie Downer on us to finish his point. But a man dies and is laid low. He breathes his last and is no more. Okay, when a man dies, he goes in the grave, no roots. He's not coming back. There's no hope. Cut the tree down, at least it can come back. As for man, he is not going to be coming back. But then, Job wrestles through from this deep depression to a moment of remarkable clarity and faith. He says, if only you, still praying to God, if only you would hide me in the grave and conceal me till your anger has passed. If only you would set me a time and then remember me. If someone dies, will they live again? They're supposed to say, no, if you die, you're dead. He continues. All the days of my hard service I will wait for my renewal to come. You will call, and I will answer you. You will long for the creature your hands have made. Here's what Job is saying. When I go into the grave, although I have no roots, I believe, God, that after your season of wrath has passed, you will remember me. You will remember me, and you will call me, and I will answer you, because you will long for the creature your hands have made. He continues. Surely then you will count my steps, but not keep track of my sin. My offenses will be sealed up in a bag. You will cover over my sin. Here's what he's saying. God, you're going to know me so well, you're going to know how many steps I take. You are the pedometer on my hip, God. That's how well you know me. But you know what you're not going to know? You're not going to keep track of my sin. Why? Because my offenses will be sealed up in a bag and you will cover over my sin. Job wrestles through to this place of remarkable gospel understanding. That God is not going to remember his sin. He will hide them and cover them. And because of that, after he has been buried, after he is dead, God will come and he will remember him and call him out of the grave. And Job will answer, "Here I am, God." How could Job possibly imagine this? All he had to go on was what he said in verse 15. You, God, will long for the creation you have made. God, I believe you long for me, you yearn for me, you love me so greatly that after I die, because you love me, you will not want to be separated from me, but you will call me, and I will answer, for you will cover over all of my sins. You will cover over all of my offenses. And then in a few chapters later, he gives what is the most famous verse of the book of Job. He says this, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. God longs for his creation, and my heart yearns for my Creator. He says, I know that God will resurrect me from the grave. If you're new to Christianity, here's what you need to know about our Christian faith. Everything we believe is not built around a belief system or a teaching. It is built around what happened in history. That after Jesus died, he was raised from death, because it was impossible for death to keep a hold on the Creator of the world. Son of God, Jesus, died for sins, raised on the third day, and he promised, because I live, you also will live. Jesus will return on the last day, and everyone will be called out. And like Job said, we will answer, because God longs for you and he yearns for you. God did not design heaven to be a spiritual only place. He designed heaven to be a physical place, and he will renew you, and he will renew all things. Why? Because he longs for his creation. He longs for his creation so much, Jesus came to redeem his creation through his life, through his death on the cross for your sins in your place. And in this we find Job's third and greatest source of comfort in his suffering. And here's what it is. Long for your resurrection. Look forward to, yearn for your resurrection. Resurrection is when all suffering ends. Resurrection is when everything sad comes untrue. Resurrection is when God makes everything the way you know it could be and should be, and we will pray with perfect transparency because we will live in God's presence. The resurrection turbocharges all of the sources of comfort. See, we have access to comfort greater than anything Job had access to. Because Job lived centuries before Jesus came, we live after Jesus came. And we can see how God, through Christ, earned this and gives this to you freely as a gift. So, when suffering comes, how do you find comfort? Not to prevent suffering, but to deal with it when it comes. To keep your whole life from shaking apart. Number one is pray with transparency. Whatever's in your heart, pray it out. God can handle it. You can pray it out to him. 2 is seek his presence, to know that God is walking with you through it. And 3, look forward to your resurrection. because whatever suffering you go through now will only make the resurrection and future glory that much sweeter in the end. And finally, remember this. You won't realize that God is all you need until God is all you have. But if God is all you have, I promise you, you will not have a single need. Now, next week, we're going to pick it up right here, and we're going to talk about God's answer, His ultimate and final answer to suffering. You do not want to miss that. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, thank you for preserving these words from the life of Job, because they are so true and so real to our experience of suffering and pain in this world. I thank you that by grace, Job was able to wrestle through and find comfort in his anguish, and I pray for everyone listening today that they too will be able to find comfort in suffering. So I ask that we would have the courage to pray with transparency to you, God. Whatever is in our hearts, we don't want to hide it from you. We want to pray it out to you and seek your presence. God, let us know that you're with us in our suffering so that we can continue to find strength as we suffer. Help us to persevere by your presence and grace. And finally, fix our eyes not on the present suffering, but on the future glory of life with you. Because if we can fix our eyes on that hope, we will have strength to persevere. For the man or woman in severe suffering this morning, bless them with relief. May this comfort give them hope. I ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.